Went to prom with this nerd. Each console has at least one defining trait. Nintendo 64 had a bunch of 3D platformers, Dreamcast had a memory card with a screen on it, and the Game Boy Advance had a screen that didn't work. Wait. Never mind, scratch that, there it is. But if there's one other thing I feel the Game Boy Advance is most well known for, it's the complete onslaught of Super Nintendo games that were ported to it. There were over 40 Super Nintendo games on this thing by the time it was discontinued in 2006. Because of this, many people refer to the Game Boy Advance as the portable Super Nintendo. So if we take a look under the hood, is it true? Did they just cram a Super Nintendo into this thing? Is the GBA really just a portable Super Nintendo? Okay, it's not, but goddamn, this was a mistake. Yeah, the Super Nintendo and Game Boy Advance are pretty different when it comes to tech specs and all that. But that's exactly why these ports have always fascinated me. They aren't just straight ports. Quite a bit of work had to be done to get these games working on such different hardware. Now, while some sacrifices had to be made in the transition, the GBA's more powerful hardware allowed them to include some pretty cool additions as well. So why don't we take a look at a few of the more noteworthy releases and see how they stack up to their 16-bit counterparts. Now, if there's one thing that's a guarantee with every Nintendo console, it's that we'll eventually get at least one completely new Mario game on it. But then you got that one rebellious son of a bitch! Yeah, for whatever reason, the Game Boy Advance never got its own original Mario game. I mean, even something like the Virtual Boy got one. Instead, we got the Mario Advance series, which were just a bunch of enhanced ports of the Super Nintendo Mario games. Mario 2, 3, World, and Yoshi's Island were all ported to the GBA thanks to the Mario Advance series. However, they chose to release them in the most backwards-ass order ever. Like, they skipped Mario 1 and started with Mario 2, and then went on to Mario World and Yoshi's Island, and then for the final Mario Advance, they went all the way back to Mario 3. Like, Christ, Nintendo, why not just be civil and, release them in order? Now, these games are weird. Like, they're all a part of the same series, but some of them could be considered full-on remakes, while others are just pretty standard ports with a few bells and whistles added on. They just didn't apply the same amount of care across the board. Take Mario Advance 1, for example. It looks like Mario 2, it smells like Mario 2. Ugh. But this is actually a from-the-ground-up remake. The difficulty's been tweaked, there's a new combo system, and Birdo fucking talks.
This is as far as you go!
There's even a new boss named Roberto, which if you ever needed proof that God's given up on us, well, here you go. They also added a ton of replay value by including 5 hidden coins in every level, and after you beat the final boss, you unlock Yoshi's Challenge, which has you searching for 2 hidden Yoshi eggs in each level. So yeah, this is a full-on remake, and I would consider it to be the best version of Mario 2, but there's one huge issue that holds it back. Screen crunch. Now, this is unfortunately an issue with all of these games, however, I feel it's especially bad in Mario Advance 1. You see, the Game Boy Advance outputs a much smaller resolution than the Super Nintendo can. Because of this, most GBA games had to be zoomed in or cropped to fit the tiny screen. And most of the time, I don't find this to be too big of a deal. I mean, it's just one of the necessary evils of trying to cram these games onto a handheld. However, Mario 2 has a bunch of these vertical sections, and every goddamn time the screen scrolls, you have to sit through these fucking screen transitions. Now, this never really bothered me on the Super Nintendo or NES, since the screen never had to scroll that much. But since the screen is so zoomed in on the GBA, you have to sit through so many more of these screen transitions. It just completely breaks the flow of the game. Honestly, even with all the added content in Mario Advance, I still prefer the Super Nintendo version just because I don't have to deal with all these goddamn screen transitions. Moving on though, the next game, Mario Advance 2, is a port of Super Mario World, and remember when I said they didn't apply the same amount of care to each of these games? Well, Mario Advance 2 is a perfect example of that, because while the first Mario Advance was a complete remake, Mario Advance 2 is honestly just a pretty faithful port of Super Mario World. Yeah, they added a new opening and gave Luigi's Mario 2 style jump, as well as adding some quality of life stuff, but other than that, it's just Mario World on the GBA. Not a bad way to play it either, in my opinion. Mario Advance 3 is a pretty similar story. It's just a portable version of Yoshi's Island with a few extra levels. I will say it was this game in particular where I really started to notice how awful the GBA sound hardware is. Like, the original Yoshi's Island had such an amazing soundtrack, but here, it sounds not that great. Which brings us to the final game in this series, Mario Advance 4. It's the All-Stars version of Mario 3, except with a brand new opening and a ton of e-reader support. Yeah, if you don't have an e-reader, this is just Mario 3 on the go. But if you had an e-reader and the necessary cards, you could unlock a ton of brand new content. For those of you who don't know, the e-reader was basically a card reader for the Game Boy Advance. You scan a card and unlock some extra content in-game for doing so. Not too different from how amiibos work. There were a ton of these cards released for Mario Advance 4. They did things as simple as giving you a few extra power-ups to the more unique cards that did things like giving you the Cape Feather from Mario World and even a set of cards that unlocked over 30 brand new levels. So yeah, there's quite a bit of new content here. If you had an e-reader. Yeah, I don't really know how to feel about this one. On one hand, the extra content is really cool, but on the other hand, it's all locked behind a really cumbersome paywall. I'd be more fine with it if the e-reader just unlocked a few extra power-ups or something, but locking so many full-size levels behind these cards is just kind of scummy. Like, it's obvious this was just an extremely desperate attempt to sell more e-readers. And since the e-reader never really took off outside of Japan, not many people got to experience most of this new content. I mean, they didn't even bother putting any of this stuff in the European release. Thankfully, in January of 2016, Nintendo released Mario Advance 4 on the Wii U's Virtual Console service, with all the e-reader levels included, which was pretty cool of them to do. I definitely recommend checking it out. The e-reader levels are honestly some of the best in the entire game. Now, the last thing worth mentioning is the remake of the original arcade Mario Bros, which was included with every Mario Advance game. Honestly, this might be the best version of this game to date. It's more or less the same game, just with improved controls and visuals. But the real star of the show here is the multiplayer. Up to 4 players just playing the original Mario Bros. It's a ton of fun if you can get a couple of friends together. I mean, what's not to love? You can play as Red Mario, Green Mario, Blue Mario, and even Jaundice. Which, speaking of Jaundice, Zelda. The Legend of Zelda A Link to the Past. And 4 Swords. It's the Super Nintendo game you know and love, but now you can, take it places. But that's not all. It also comes with a brand new game, The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords. Now, the Link to the Past part of this package is honestly just a really solid port of the original. It looks, sounds, and plays just like the Super Nintendo version. There honestly isn't much to complain about here. Well, besides the fact that they decided to give Link a voice, which, I don't know, man. Hearing this Link grunt and yell just feels wrong. Especially since they just reused young Link's voice from Ocarina of Time, which doesn't fit this Link at all in my opinion. So yeah, pretty standard port, but that's only half the experience. Things get a bit more interesting once you jump on over to 4 Swords. Now, this is actually a multiplayer only experience. It's you and up to 3 friends going through a series of dungeons together. While it can be a huge pain to set up, especially with 4 people, since you need 4 GBAs, 3 link cables, and 4 separate copies of the game, it is more than worth the hassle. It's just got this perfect blend of cooperative and competitive gameplay that I just love. It's unfortunately on the short side though, with only 4 dungeons. However, they all get a completely randomized layout with each playthrough, which makes this game endlessly replayable. Now, if you manage to complete both 4 Swords and A Link to the Past, you'll unlock the Palace of the 4 Swords, a completely new dungeon in A Link to the Past. Yeah, it's kinda lame. It's just extremely short, and is more so a series of 4 remixed bosses instead of an actual Zelda dungeon. All you get for completing it is an altered version of the credits where the clips of Hyrule are just replaced with a Dark World. So yeah, the extra stuff added to A Link to the Past isn't that exciting, but it's at least a nice little reward for completing both games. But you know what is exciting? Super Donkey Kong! Also known as Donkey Kong Country of the West. But yeah, that! Now, I absolutely adore these games. I even consider Donkey Kong Country 2 to be my favorite game of all time. So how do these versions compare? Okay, not really, but these are kind of a mixed bag, I guess you could say. Like, I was pretty surprised by just how different these are. I don't know, I guess I was expecting them to be fairly basic ports. I mean, they're literally just called Donkey Kong Country 1, 2, and 3, and not Donkey Kong Country Advanced or something like that. Well, the reason these are so different is because they were actually coded completely from scratch by Rare. You see, apparently the original assets were all stored on old floppy disks. So instead of trying to work through and convert all the old stuff, they decided it'd just be easier to start over. Now, one of the biggest reasons why I love the Donkey Kong Country trilogy as much as I do is honestly just down to how it feels to play them. Everything just has this sense of rhythm to it. The way you roll through enemies to gain speed, the level design, and physics are all perfectly tuned to a degree that honestly no other game has been able to replicate. And sadly, that's also true for these remakes as well. Now, don't get me wrong, they got damn close with these recreations, but something just feels off about them. Like, they feel slower. Everything just lacks that distinct flow from the originals. However, this is only really true for the first 2 remakes. You see, they didn't just copy and paste the same physics across all 3 games. They actually continued to tweak things as they went along. Because of this, by the time Rare started working on the Donkey Kong Country 3 remake, they had an engine that was nearly identical to the original. And now it's not 1-to-1 or anything, but it still feels damn good to play. They didn't just nail the physics with this one though, they also nailed the visuals as well. Yeah, I should probably address the elephant in the room. These games look like a goddamn washed out mess, but that's just kinda what you had to do when you developed for the GBA. You see, the Game Boy Advance's screen doesn't have a backlight, and the Donkey Kong Country series is known for having these dark, realistic visuals, and there is no way graphics like this would have worked on a screen like this. So they had to turn up the contrast and brightness to the max to compensate. And you know what? On the original GBA screen, it didn't look that bad. But Nintendo did eventually release a model with a backlight, and if you play these games on there, oh boy. Donkey Kong Country 2 unfortunately got it the worst, with its dark and foreboding atmosphere of breaking into enemy lines being completely ruined. However, the Country 3 remake honestly looks great regardless of what kind of screen you're playing it on. Rare had nearly perfected things at this point, and because of this, they were actually interested in developing a proper Donkey Kong Country 4 with this new engine. Unfortunately though, that never happened, but god damn, that would have been cool. Now, since they were making these from scratch anyways, Rare took the opportunity to expand upon the originals as well. They included new cutscenes, minigames, bosses, and the DKC3 remake even introduced a brand new 7th world with 6 new levels. They even got David Wise to create a whole new soundtrack for Donkey Kong Country 3. For those of you who don't know, David Wise is the man behind the legendary soundtracks of the first 2 DKC games. However, he originally didn't return for the 3rd game. Instead, the job was given to Evelyn Fisher, and she did a fine enough job, but a lot of people agreed this just didn't compare to what came before it. David Wise's new soundtrack, on the other hand, feels a bit more in line with what you'd expect from the series. However, I feel like some of these new tracks just don't fit the tone of the game as well as the original. I mean, just listen to how different the map themes are. Donkey Kong Country 3 has always been viewed as the black sheep of the series. It just lacked most of the original talent behind the first two games. Rare's B team worked on this one, and it unfortunately showed. However, I'd argue this remake fixes most of the issues the original had. This feels like what Donkey Kong Country 3 should have been from the start. But I can't say the same for the other two remakes. While there's a lot of fun extras included, these are just overall worst versions of the originals. The visuals are washed out, the controls aren't nearly as polished, and the GBA sound hardware doesn't do the soundtracks any justice. So skip the first two remakes, but definitely pick up the third. I'd easily recommend Donkey Kong Country 3 on the Game Boy Advance over the original any day. So yeah, that's just a few of the Super Nintendo games that were brought over to the Game Boy Advance. While they're not the best versions of these games, I'd definitely say they're the most unique. Even though it's easier than ever nowadays to play these games on the go, there's still very much a place for these versions due to all the exclusive content they offer. This helps give them their own unique identity and stand apart from the originals. I feel like most people at the time would have been fine if these were just portable versions of these games. I mean, the idea of handheld gaming was still a pretty novel concept at this point. But the fact that these aren't just straight ports shows how much love and care went into these. And that's part of the reason why I don't agree with calling the Game Boy Advance a portable Super Nintendo. Because that's severely underselling the system. The Game Boy Advance isn't just a way to play these games portably. It's a way to have brand new experiences with these classic games.